Hey folks, Kevin here. Well, it's September 18th, 2018. I'm outside. We've had a real hot go of things for a while now, and I'm taking a little bit of a break and doing an episode of Ask Me Anything. First, I'd like to say thank you to all of you who have commented and asked questions. Not only is it fulfilling to have people respond to the videos that we're creating, it's also exciting and gives me some ideas of where to go next with the direction of the videos that we create. So your input is very important to us, and I thank you for that. This is an episode of Ask Me Anything, and recently 1994 Abby Girl commented after harvesting the posting the Blue Hubbard squash harvesting video. She said, "Wow, what a great haul on Blue Hubbard squash. How do you process them? Blessings." Well, thank you very much, Abby Girl. I appreciate it. So I thought I'd start off first with a link to that I'll put in the description below to Fruition Seeds. Petra does a really good job of talking about telling how ripe winter squash is, curing it, and storing it. I'm no expert in this area. I'm still on the upward trend to the learning curve, and this is our first time growing the Georgia sweet candy roaster squash, which we've had one already, and it's amazing. Oops, sorry about that. Bumped into the camera. And our Blue Hubbard squash, which has also been very successful growing them this year. I apologize for the camera wiggling. So I'm going to start off with saying that from the time that we have a pollinated flower, not from the time that we put either direct seed or put the transplants into the soil, but once we get a flower that has been pollinated, and you'll see that little bulbous area at the base of the flower, that bulb is going to mature into a full-fledged squash plant if given a full 2 months in the field on the vine. There's lots of things that I've learned over the process the last few years, and I would just mention this. If the vine gets damaged, let's say it gets kinked when you're walking around, we have these massive plants that are probably planted about every 3 foot apart, and you're trying to work your way through the area, or you're pruning them, as I talked about in a previous video, and you damage part of the vine, and as long as it's still connected, you can take that part of the vine, cover it up with some soil, and it'll re-root right there. And the vitality, there might be a little bit of a slowdown in the maturation of that squash, but they tend to keep doing pretty well. So that's just one little pearl that I've learned over time. I'll mention something else as well while I'm thinking of it. So many YouTube videos that I've seen talking about the maturation of squash, they'll use the fingernail test. Certainly I think that is accurate for the butternut squash and for the acorn squash, but I don't know that it's accurate for these two squash plants. Now again, this is my first season growing these two heirloom squash plants. And I'll probably be able to give you an update in a couple of years on further information. But I know that most of these squash plants that we harvested were a full 2 months from the time that the little bulbs started appearing at the base of the flower, the pollinated flower rather. I misspoke earlier. It's the pollinated flower. So once they've been in the field on the vine for a full 2 months maturing, then and that brings us to about beginning of September, mid-September. Then it's time to harvest them. People will also talk about taking the squash plants and setting them on top of, setting cardboard or a rock or a newspaper underneath them so that they probably so that there's less chance of a opportunistic mold infection because the rind or the skin hasn't cured yet and hardened up. Now the Georgia candy roaster squash we grew on a hoop trellis, and they just got so big and so heavy that some of them snapped off at the base of the fruit where the vine connects. So we lost this part, and they spoil more quickly. You could still go through the process of curing them, but they don't do quite as well. Some of them fell and broke when they hit the ground. So we harvested these a couple of weeks ago. Now the Blue Hubbards, we ran into problems with the rodents getting into them, and the deer going through and snapping some of the vines as well. So we had those issues. So I don't know how I'm going to work those issues out in the future, but I'm going to do my best. I'll be thinking about it. But let's say in this climate zone that we're in a 5A, where in beginning to mid-September is when to harvest them. I would have waited at least another week with both of these, 2 weeks with a roaster, the Georgia roaster candy squash, and at least 1 week with the Blue Hubbard squash. But that's how things worked out. It also, I think with respect to curing, we need to think about what the temperature is going to be or how we're going to cure them. It's best that we cure the winter squash in about 80-degree temperatures. Now it's hard to keep a room temperature at about 80 degrees. Our Harbor Freight little greenhouse over here, we have some wire shelving that sits on top of our shelving, and we've spread both of these squash out on those wire racks, and that allows for airflow to get underneath it, so I don't have to worry about turning them as much. Now, a couple of the ones that were not on wire racks, well, they started to have some lesions on the base where they were laying. So unfortunately, we lost some of our squash. So you really want to have them a good week to 2 weeks in about 80-degree temperature with really good airflow in order to cure the squash. Then what about storing the squash? Once you've got them cured, you want to put them in a location where the temperature is probably between the above 60, less than 70 would be probably ideal, 65 degrees Fahrenheit, where there's good airflow through the environment and not overly humid as well. What the exact humidity needs to be, I just don't know. However, that's one of the things we're working on here, is trying to create the ideal curing locations for each different fruit and produce that we are harvesting, from everything from our food forest to our vegetable gardens and all. So you wouldn't want to take apples and store them with your winter squash, because as the apples are sitting around, they're emitting ethylene gas, which is one of the hormones that stimulate an effect in produce. So that's going to shorten the shelf life of your winter squash. And getting to know what the shelf life is really important. Now we picked the Georgia Candy Roaster and the Blue Hubbard squash varieties, one because they're heirlooms, and because they're known for being able to store right until spring anyways, where people can get them. Now some of our squash, because of being damaged or not having the full stage of maturity, we've gone ahead and eaten our first Georgia Sweet Candy Roaster squash, but we've got a couple more squash that we're going to have to cook up and process. So, excuse me, how are we going to process them? Well, typically what we do in the short term is we'll roast them. Thea roasts them in the oven. Thea will roast them in the oven, and then we'll have that along with other food dishes and put them in the freezer to store. And we may just do that. But you can also, can this just like you'd can pumpkin for pumpkin pie later on, or pumpkin bread and all that. So we're going to be experimenting with these depending on how much we've got to actually deal with. If throughout this curing process, if we see we've got to have the time because we're real busy right now, and then we'll decide on whether it's worth it to do the actual canning or cooking and freezing and all. So I hope that I've adequately answered your question, Abby Girl. Again, I really appreciate everyone's contributions to the community here. I think it's wonderful that we can all learn from each other. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. I'd appreciate it. If you thought this video gave you some information, it inspired you, gave you things to think about, please give us a thumbs up. Share it with your friends. Hit that bell icon if you want to be notified when we post more videos. And certainly, folks, have a super fantastic day. Bye-bye now.